She didn't cry when they moved away from her. She had already learned not to. Every Sunday, Clara Whitmore walked into that church, sat in the very last pew, and watched the town she had lived in her whole life pretend she didn't exist. The women turned their backs. The men looked through her. And the children, even the children, were pulled away before they could get too close. She was 34 years old and already treated like something that needed to be disposed of. Then one morning, a stranger walked through those church doors, and nothing in Willow Creek was ever the same again. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow Clara's story all the way to the end. Drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The morning it all began, Clara Whitmore woke before the sun. She didn't need an alarm. She hadn't slept well in 4 years. Sleep, real sleep, the kind that holds you and doesn't let go until morning, had left her around the same time her husband did. She lay still for a moment in the dark of her rented room above the feed store, listening to the wind move through the gaps in the window frame. It was the kind of wind that had no direction, just cold and persistent, the kind that reminded you. Winter didn't care what you were going through. She sat up, put her feet on the floor, and said the same thing she said every morning quietly to no one in particular. All right, one more day. That was all she gave herself. Not a week, not a month, just one more day. Willow Creek was a small town in the way that most frontier towns were small, not just in size, but in memory. People remembered everything. They kept your story for you even when you didn't want them to. They passed it down at dinner tables, whispered it over, back fences, dressed it up with a little extra detail when the original version started to feel too ordinary. Clara Whitmore's story had been told so many times that most people in town had forgotten they hadn't witnessed it themselves. The story went like this. Thomas Whitmore had married Clara when she was 27. She was a good woman, people agreed on that much. Quiet, hard-working, faithful. She kept a clean house, cooked well, and never caused a scene. But after 7 years of marriage, she had not given Thomas a child. And a man who owned 40 acres of ranch land needed a son. So Thomas left. I didn't make a spectacle of it. He was too careful for that. He simply began telling neighbors one by one that he'd stayed as long as he could, that a ranch needed to continue, that Clara had not been able to give him what the land required. He said it with a kind of sadness that made people feel sorry for him. No one asked Clara her side of it. By the time Thomas was courting a new woman from the county over, Clara had already been quietly redefined. She wasn't a wife who had been abandoned. She was a woman who had failed. And in Willow Creek, that was a permanent condition. The first time Clara understood what had happened to her reputation, she was standing in the dry goods store. She had come in on a Tuesday afternoon to buy flour and sugar. Simple, ordinary, the kind of errand she had run 100 times before. But this time, when she walked through the door, the two women standing near the counter, Edna Marsh and her daughter-in-law Ruth, went quiet in a way that was deliberate. They didn't stop talking because they had nothing to say. They stopped talking because they wanted her to know they'd been talking about her. Edna turned, looked at Clara directly, and offered the kind of smile that is not a smile at all. "Clara," she said. Just the name, nothing attached to it. Edna. Clara kept walking. She went to the shelf. She picked up the flour. Behind her, she heard Ruth lean in toward Edna and whisper something. She couldn't make out the words. She didn't need to. She paid for her things. She walked out. She didn't let her hands shake until she was around the corner and out of sight. That night, sitting alone at her small table with a cup of tea she barely touched, she made herself a rule. Don't hope for kindness from people who have already decided who you are. It wasn't bitterness. It was just survival. Sundays were the hardest. Church was not optional in Willow Creek. If you stopped attending, people would talk. And Clara had decided a long time ago that she would not give the town the satisfaction of seeing her disappear. So she went. Every week. She put on her best dress, which was not a very fine dress, but it was clean and pressed, and she walked the 6 blocks to the church, and she sat in the very last pew. She had tried other pews once early on, when the separation from Thomas was new. She had tried sitting in the third row, where she and Thomas used to sit together. She made it through exactly one hymn before Martha Connolly leaned over from the row in front, turned halfway around, and said in a stage whisper that could have been heard by God himself, "You might be more comfortable toward the back, dear." Clara had stood up, walked to the back pew, and sat down. She never tried to move forward again. The back pew became her place. And in that place, she learned to be invisible in a room full of people who saw her perfectly well. The Sunday everything changed was a Sunday in early October. The air had that particular sharpness to it that comes before the first frost, and the church smelled like candle wax and the dried flowers the women's committee had arranged near the altar. Clara had arrived early, as she always did. She did not enjoy the ritual of walking in late, of feeling every head turned toward the sound of the door. She was already seated when the congregation began filing in. She watched without watching. That was a skill she'd developed. You could see everything without appearing to look at anything. She watched families settle into their pews. She watched the Connolly family fill an entire row. She watched Pastor Mills arrange his notes with the particular kind of nervous energy that meant he was about to deliver a sermon he wasn't sure about. She watched the door. People came in and found their places with the ease of people who knew exactly where they belonged. And then a man she did not recognize walked through the door. He was tall. Not in a theatrical way, just the natural kind of tall that takes up space without trying to. He had the hands of someone who worked outdoors, roughened, deliberate. His coat was clean, but not new. His hat he removed the moment he stepped inside, which was a habit not every man bothered with. He stood at the back of the church for a moment, looking at the room the way a person looks at something when they're trying to find their footing, rather than when they're trying to be seen. Clara watched him scan the pews. She watched him notice the families, the clusters, the unspoken arrangements of who sat where. And then she watched him notice her. He didn't look away. Most people looked at her and then immediately looked somewhere else, the way you look away from something uncomfortable. This man looked at her the way you look at something you've noticed and are still thinking about. Clara dropped her eyes to her Bible. She heard footsteps. She did not look up. The footsteps stopped beside her pew. "Would you mind if I sat here?" His voice was quiet. Not a performance. Just a question, the same way you'd ask someone to pass the salt. Clara looked up. The man was standing at the end of her pew with his hat in his hands, and he was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen directed at her in a very long time. Not pity, not charity, just ordinary human inquiry. Would you mind? As if she had a preference. As if what she thought about it mattered. The entire church had gone quiet. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in that particular way a room gets quiet when something unexpected happens, and everyone is trying to process it without appearing to watch too closely. Clara was aware of every single pair of eyes in that building. She was also aware that this man, whoever he was, didn't seem to be aware of them at all. Or if he was, he didn't consider them relevant to the question he'd just asked. "No," she said. "I don't mind." He nodded. Sat down. Set his hat on his knee. Opened the hymnal that sat in the rack in front of him. The congregation slowly returned to its own business. But Clara sat very still, and she felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could name. She felt like a person who had just been treated normally. His name was Ethan Walker. She found this out not from him, but from the whispers that began circulating the moment the service ended. She didn't hear it all at once. She heard it in fragments, the way you hear things when you're not supposed to be listening. She was pulling on her gloves near the door when she caught her name threaded through someone else's conversation. The new man who bought Red Hollow sat right beside Clara Whitmore. Someone ought to tell him. She didn't turn around. She walked out, but she stored the name away. Ethan Walker, Red Hollow Ranch. She knew Red Hollow. Everyone did. It was the property that had changed hands 3 times in 12 years and never seemed to work right for anyone who owned it. Too isolated. Too run down. Too much history baked into the fences and the floors. She wondered briefly what kind of man bought a place like that. And then she told herself it wasn't her business and walked home. 3 days later, there was a knock at the door of her rented room. Clara was not accustomed to knocks. The feed store owner, Mr. Holt, sometimes knocked when her rent was late, but it was only the 4th of the month. The pastor occasionally sent his wife with something from the Women's Auxiliary, which was Willow Creek's way of being charitable, while maintaining the appropriate distance. She opened the door. Ethan Walker was standing on the landing. Clara stared at him. He had his hat in his hand again, she noticed. Same habit as the church. He seemed to automatically remove it in the presence of another person, which was not. She was beginning to understand a common trait. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "It's Mrs." she said reflexively. Then she caught herself, because the correction was old habit and technically no longer accurate. He didn't comment on it. "Mrs. Whitmore, my name is Ethan Walker. I recently purchased Red Hollow Ranch." "I know who you are," she said before she could stop herself. Something flickered across his face. Not quite amusement, just awareness. "Then I'll skip the introduction." He paused. "I'll get directly to the reason I came. I need help at the ranch. The house is in poor condition. My workers don't have anyone managing household supplies or keeping things organized. I've got 4 men who are sleeping on cots in a barn and eating poorly because no one knows how to run a kitchen. I've been told you're capable and available. I'm offering work fair wages and the use of a proper room in the main house." Clara looked at him for a long moment. There were 100 things she could have said. She could have asked who told him she was capable. She could have said she had her dignity, even if the town had tried to take it. She could have said she wasn't interested in being someone's charity project. She said none of those things. She said, "Who told you about me?" He said Noah Briggs. He works the livery. He said you sewed his sister's curtains last spring, and you didn't charge her full price because she was short. He said you know how to stretch $1, and you don't complain about hard work. Clara blinked. Noah Briggs was 16 years old. She hadn't thought he'd noticed anything she'd done. "When would you need me to start?" she asked. "Soon as you're willing." She looked past him for a moment at the landing at the narrow staircase below. At the street she could just see from the window. At the town that had quietly agreed she was nothing. "Give me an hour to pack," she said. Red Hollow Ranch was exactly as bad as she'd been told, and somewhat worse than she'd imagined. The main house had not been properly cleaned in what appeared to be 2 years. The kitchen was missing several essential items, and had several more that were broken. The larder was stocked with the kind of disorganized abundance that means someone has been buying things without tracking what they already have or what they actually need. The 4 workers Ethan had mentioned were named Gil Russ Pete and a young man of 17 named Noah. Not the same Noah from the livery, but a different one who had the particular look of someone who has been surviving on stubbornness and not much else. When she walked through the front door that first afternoon, all 4 men were sitting in the kitchen. They looked at her the way men look at a situation they didn't expect and aren't sure how to respond to. Gil, who was the oldest and appeared to have appointed himself spokesman, crossed his arms and said, "So you're the one Walker brought in?" "It appears so," Clara said. She set her bag down. She looked at the kitchen. She looked at the men. "Has anyone eaten today?" Silence. "A proper meal," she clarified. "Not jerky, not cold biscuits from yesterday." More silence. "All right," she said. "Someone show me where the root cellar is." By the end of that first week, several things had changed. The men were eating actual meals twice a day. The kitchen was organized. Clara had found in the back of what appeared to be a storage closet 3 good cast iron pans that no one had been using because they were under a pile of harness leather that had no reason to be there. The young ranch hand Noah, this Noah the 17-year-old, started appearing in the kitchen at odd hours. Not to ask for anything, just to be nearby. Clara noticed, but didn't make a production of it. On the 5th evening, she set a plate in front of him at the table, while the others were still outside, and said, "You don't have to hover by the door. You can sit." He sat. He ate. He didn't say much. After a while he said, "My mother used to make something like this." Clara said, "What happened to her?" "Fever, 3 years ago," Clara said. "I'm sorry." She meant it the way you mean something when you actually understand what loss feels like in your body. Noah looked at his plate. It's good, he said, meaning the food, meaning something else. Thank you, Clara said, meaning the same. It was Gil who first started talking about her in town. Not badly, just talking. He came into the feed store on a Wednesday and told Mr. Holt that Red Hollow had a woman running the house now, and the place was a different situation than it had been last month. He said it as a practical matter, the way you report that a fence has been mended or a well has been cleared. Holt mentioned it to his wife. His wife mentioned it to Edna Marsh. And Edna Marsh, who had spent 4 years perfecting her opinion of Clara Whitmore, went very quiet in a way her daughter-in-law Ruth had learned to pay attention to. Walker brought her out there, Edna said. That's what Harold says. Edna picked up her coffee cup, put it down again. Well, she said, and there was an entire editorial in that one word. 2 weeks after Clara had arrived at Red Hollow, Ethan found her in the kitchen at 7 in the morning, making a list. She had already made 3 lists that week. Lists of what needed to be repaired. Lists of what needed to be purchased. Lists of what the men needed in terms of their gear that had been neglected. He stood in the doorway for a moment before she noticed him. When she looked up, he said, "You've been here 2 weeks." "I'm aware." The men are different. Clara waited. She had learned that Ethan Walker was not a man who made speeches. When he spoke he was arriving somewhere. You had to let him get there. "Noah," he said. "The boy. He used to eat standing up by the back door like he was about to leave at any moment." Clara said nothing. "He sat down last night," Ethan said, "at the table, with the others, like it was his place." A pause. "That's because of you," he said. Clara looked at her list. He just needed someone to tell him it was all right to stay. Ethan looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not admiration exactly. Something quieter than that. Something that looked like recognition. "I wanted to say thank you," he said. "You pay me a fair wage," Clara said. "That's thanks enough." He nodded once. He poured himself coffee. He went back outside. Clara sat with her list and felt something strange move through her chest. Not happiness exactly. More like the memory of it. It was a Saturday 3 weeks in when the first real blow arrived. She heard about it from Noah. The boy had gone into town for supplies and come back with the grocery order and something extra he hadn't bargained for. He set the crates on this kitchen table and didn't say anything for a moment, which was enough to tell Clara something had happened. "What is it?" she said. He picked at the edge of the crate. "Mr. Thomas Whitmore is back in town." The name landed the way a stone lands in still water. Everything rippled outward. Clara set down the pot she was holding. Carefully. The way you put something down when you're concentrating on not letting your hands show what your heart is doing. "Is he?" she said. "He's staying at the Connollys." A pause. "He's got a woman with him. From Harlan County. People are saying he's planning to marry her." Clara picked up the pot again, went back to what she was doing. "Clara," Noah said. The way he said it, not Mrs. Whitmore, just Clara, because somehow in 3 weeks they had arrived at first names without discussing it. The way he said it told her he was worried about her. She turned and looked at him. He was 17 years old, and he had the face of someone who had lost too much, too young, and learned to pay attention because of it. "I'm fine," she said. He was saying things, Noah said. "In town. About you. About why you were out here." Clara felt the familiar cold settle into her stomach. The specific cold that comes when you know what's coming, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. "What things?" she said, even though she already knew. Noah's jaw tightened. "That Walker only hired you out of pity. That you couldn't get anyone to take you in, and he felt sorry for you." The kitchen was very quiet. "He said that," Clara said, not a question. "In front of 3 people at the general store," Noah said. "I was right there. I heard it." Clara turned back to the stove. Her hands were steady. She made herself focus on that. Her hands were steady. "Go wash up before supper," she said. "Clara." "Noah." Her voice was gentle but firm. "Go wash up." He went. She stood at the stove alone and breathed through the place in her chest where something had just cracked. She had known Thomas would come back eventually. She had known this because men who need to be right have to keep returning to the places where their story lives. And Willow Creek was where Thomas Whitmore's story about Clara Whitmore lived. She just hadn't thought it would hurt this much to hear it still being told. She didn't tell Ethan. She told herself it wasn't his concern. She was an employee. Her past was her own business. He was running a ranch, not managing her history. But Ethan found out anyway. Not from Clara. Not from Noah. From Gil, who had heard from Russ, who had been in the barber shop when Thomas Whitmore's name came up again in a conversation that was clearly designed to be overheard. Ethan came into the kitchen that evening. Clara was cleaning up after supper. The other men had gone out. Noah was somewhere in the barn. It was just the two of them. Ethan stood with his back against the far wall and his arms crossed. Not in a confrontational way. In the way of a man who is gathering himself before he says something. Clara kept washing the dishes. "I heard Thomas Whitmore is in town," Ethan said. "People talk," Clara said. "They do." A pause. "I also heard what he's been saying." The sound of water. The sound of a dish being set down. "Clara," Ethan said. She turned. The look on his face was not pity. She was sure of that. She had become an expert at recognizing pity. And this was not it. This was something more like anger controlled very carefully. "I didn't hire you out of pity," he said. "I want to make sure you know that." Clara looked at him. "I know that. Because if you're here wondering whether that's the real reason, I'm not." She picked up another dish. "You hired me because Noah from the livery told you I was capable. And because you needed someone capable. That's the beginning and the end of it." A silence. "Good," Ethan said. He pushed off the wall. He was about to leave. Clara said without planning to, "He's going to keep talking. Thomas. That's who he is. He needs the story to stay the way he told it." Ethan turned back. He looked at her steadily. "Let him talk." "You don't understand what that means in a town like this," Clara said. "The talking doesn't stop at the edge of town. It comes out here eventually." "I know," Ethan said. "It could affect your reputation. The ranch. The men's willingness to be associated." "Clara." His voice was quiet. Absolutely certain. "Let him talk." She stood there holding a dish she'd already cleaned twice. She didn't know what to do with a person who said something like that. Ethan Walker looked at her one more time. In that way, he had the way that didn't flinch and didn't apologize, and he said, "What Thomas Whitmore says about you is his story, not yours. And the difference between the two things is something I can see perfectly clearly." He went out. Clara stood in the kitchen for a long time, and for the first time in 4 years, she did not feel alone in a room that she was the only person in. Outside, the wind was picking up. Somewhere on the ridge, a gate had come loose and was banging in the dark. The men would deal with it tomorrow. Tonight the ranch was quiet in the way that things are quiet before they're tested. And in the kitchen of Red Hollow, Clara Whitmore set the last clean dish on the shelf, turned down the lamp, and walked to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed. She put her hands in her lap. And very slowly, without quite understanding why, she let herself cry. Not the bitter kind of crying she had done in the first months after Thomas left. Not the exhausted kind she did when loneliness pressed down too hard. This was something else. Something closer to relief. Like a door that had been locked for years had just very slightly come open. The gate that had been banging in the wind all night was still banging when Clara woke up. She lay still for 30 seconds listening to it. Then she got up, put on her coat over her nightgown, walked out the back door, and fixed it herself with a piece of wire she found hanging on the post beside it. The night was cold and clear. She could see her breath. Her fingers were numb by the time she got back inside. She did not think about Thomas Whitmore. She did not think about what he'd said in the general store. She thought about the gate. Then she thought about breakfast, because the men would be up in 2 hours, and there was work to be done before any of them needed feeding. That was how she survived things. She filled the space in front of her so completely that the things behind her couldn't find room to sit down. By the time Ethan came through the kitchen door at 5:30, there was coffee on the stove, biscuits in the oven, and a list on the table with 7 items on it that needed attention before the week was out. He looked at the list. He looked at her. He said, "You fixed the gate." "It was loud," she said. He picked up the list. He read it without expression. Then he said, "Number 4, the cellar door. I've been meaning to get to that for 3 weeks." "I know," she said. "That's why I put it on the list." He looked at her over the paper. There was something in his expression that might have been the very beginning of a smile, though it hadn't quite committed to being one yet. He folded the list and put it in his shirt pocket. "All right," he said. He poured coffee. She went back to the biscuits. It was the most ordinary moment she had experienced in 4 years. 2 people in a kitchen in the early morning, both of them just doing what needed to be done. No weight to it. No performance. No one being judged or carefully watched. She was so startled by how normal it felt that she almost burned the biscuits. Gil noticed things. That was what Gil did. He was 53 years old and had worked ranches all his life and had developed through decades of close quarters with people he hadn't chosen a finely tuned awareness of what was happening between the people around him. Not gossip, not prying, just noticing. He noticed that Clara woke up before anyone else and went to sleep after everyone else. He noticed that the young Noah, the 17-year-old, had stopped eating standing up and now sat at the table every single night. He noticed that the ranch, which had felt like a place people were just passing through when they arrived, was starting to feel like somewhere people actually lived. And he noticed that Ethan Walker, who had been running on coffee and stubbornness since he'd bought the property, had started to look like a man who was sleeping again. On a Friday morning, about 4 weeks after Clara arrived, Gil came into the kitchen while she was working and sat down at the table without asking. "You know what this place looked like before you came," he said. Clara kept working. "I can imagine. It looked like somewhere men went to work until something better came along," Gil said. "Nobody cared about it. Nobody tried to make it right. Now it feels different." A pause. "You did that." Clara set down what she was holding and looked at him directly. Gil was not a sentimental man. He was the kind of man who said things because they were true, not because they were nice. "I just cleaned the place up," she said. Gil shook his head. "That's not all you did, and you know it." She picked up what she'd set down and went back to work. But something settled in her chest, something quiet and solid. He got up to leave, and at the door he stopped without turning around and said, "Whatever that man in town is saying about you, he's wrong. I wanted you to hear that from somebody who's actually watched you work." Then he walked out. Clara stood in the kitchen alone. She pressed her lips together very hard for exactly 3 seconds. Then she made herself get back to work. The trouble came on a Tuesday. It came in the shape of Edna Marsh's carriage pulling up the front drive of Red Hollow Ranch at 2 in the afternoon, which was not a time for social calls, and everyone on the property knew it. Clara watched from the kitchen window, not the window she was near it working, as Edna climbed down from the carriage with the deliberate care of a woman who is aware that her arrival is a statement. Ruth was with her. Behind them, a third woman. Clara didn't immediately recognize. She recognized her a beat later. Margaret Hale, wife of the county land assessor. A woman whose opinion in Willow Creek carried the particular weight of someone connected to power. Clara dried her hands on her apron. She went to the front room. She didn't go to the door. She waited. The knock came. She counted to 3. Then she opened it. Edna smiled, the same smile as the dry goods store. "Clara, what a surprise finding you here." "Is it?" Clara said. Edna's smile stayed fixed. "We were passing by and thought we'd call on Mr. Walker." A pause that said everything. "But perhaps you can help us. Is he available?" "He's working," Clara said. "I can take a message." Edna looked past her into the house the way people look at things they're cataloging. "The place looks tidier than I remember," she said, which was both a compliment and not one. Margaret Hale had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. Ruth was studying the porch railing. "I'll let Mr. Walker know you called," Clara said. "We were actually hoping to speak with him ourselves," Edna said. About the property. There's some question in town about his long-term plans for Red Hollow, and several families with adjacent land are curious about his intentions. There it was. Clara recognized it immediately. Edna Marsh had not driven out here to ask about land. She had driven out here to take inventory. To see with her own eyes what was happening at Red Hollow, what role Clara was playing, and whether there was anything to report back to Thomas Whitmore and the rest of Willow Creek. His intentions, Clara said, are to run a successful ranch. I'll pass along that you stopped by. She smiled the kind of smile that closes a door politely but firmly. Have a safe drive back. She closed the door. She stood in the front room with her back against the closed door and her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Behind her through the door, she heard the faint sound of Edna saying something to Ruth. Then the sound of the carriage. Then silence. Clara exhaled. She went back to the kitchen. She picked up exactly where she'd left off. She did not allow her hands to shake, and they obeyed her. She told Ethan about it that evening. She had almost decided not to. It felt like something she should handle herself the same way she'd handled everything else for 4 years. But he came in from the south field at 6 and could read her face the way he read the list she'd left on the table efficiently without a lot of extra interpretation needed. What happened? He said. It wasn't a question. She told him. All of it. Edna's carriage. The 3 women. The conversation. The implied message underneath the words about land and long-term plans. When she finished, Ethan poured himself water from the pitcher, drank it, set the cup down. She was checking up on you, he said. She was checking up on the situation, Clara said. I'm part of the situation. What did you say to her? I told her you were working. I said I'd pass along that she called. Then I closed the door. Ethan looked at her for a moment. Good, he said. Clara shook her head. It's not good. Edna Marsh talks to half the county. Whatever she saw out here today or thinks she saw is going to be in 15 kitchens by Thursday. And what do you think she saw? Clara hesitated. A woman living in a man's house who doesn't have much else to her name. The words sat between them, honest and ugly. Ethan set down the cup. He turned to face her fully, which was something she'd noticed he did when he was about to say something he meant completely. And what is actually true, he said, is that a woman runs this house, manages this ranch's operations, and has turned this property around in 4 weeks. Those are the same facts. The difference is in how a person decides to look at them. Clara said nothing. I don't care what Edna Marsh saw, Ethan said. I care what's actually happening here. And what's happening here is that this place is working. Because of you. Clara looked at the table, then back at him. She said, You make it sound simple. It is simple, he said. Other people make it complicated. She almost said something. She pulled it back. She wasn't sure what she'd been about to say, and that made her careful. I'll have supper on the table in 20 minutes, she said. He nodded. He went to wash up. Clara stood very still for one moment in the kitchen that she had made functional and warm and organized. In the house that 3 weeks ago had felt like a place people were just passing through. She thought about what he'd said. Those are the same facts. The difference is in how a person decides to look at them. She had never had anyone say something like that to her. Not Thomas. Not the pastor. Not anyone. It was the kind of thing that should be obvious. It was the kind of thing that felt when someone finally said it directly to you, like water after a very long dry spell. Noah started talking more. Not constantly, not with the particular brightness of a boy who had never had trouble speaking, but in the gradual way of someone who has learned that speaking has consequences and is slowly unlearning that fear. He started asking Clara questions. Small ones at first. What was she putting in the broth? Why did she double salt the pan before adding the meat? Then larger ones. How did she know when something wasn't right about the livestock's feed? How did she organize the supply list so nothing got forgotten? She answered all of them. Without a big performance of patience, just the straightforward answering of questions asked by someone who wanted to learn. One evening he asked her something she hadn't expected. They were in the kitchen after supper. Everyone else had gone out. He was sitting at the table while she cleaned up in his usual position of being present without taking up more space than he had to. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You've been asking me things for 2 weeks," she said. "Why are you asking permission now?" He looked at the table. "This one's different." She turned. "Go ahead." He picked at the edge of the table. Old habit of his. She'd noticed it when he was working up to saying something. "Why do you keep going into town on market days and such, when you know how people are going to treat you?" He looked up. "I'd stop going." Clara considered this for a moment. "Because disappearing is what they want," she said. "Who's they?" "People who've decided what you are and need you to stay in the story they've written. If you disappear, the story stands. If you keep showing up, eventually the story has to change, or you do." She paused. "I decided a long time ago it wasn't going to be me." Noah looked at her with an expression that was something between relief and recognition. "My mother used to say something like that," he said quietly. "What did she say?" "She said the worst thing you can do when people treat you like you don't matter is act like you don't." He paused. "She said you have to keep showing up and doing the right thing even when nobody's watching." "Your mother," Clara said, "was a wise woman." "Yeah," he said. "Just the one word. Carrying everything." He got up from the table and went to bed without saying more. Clara finished cleaning the kitchen alone. She thought about his mother. She thought about what it meant to keep showing up when the world is telling you to stop. She thought 17 years old, and he already understands it. The second blow came from a direction she hadn't expected. She was in town on a Wednesday buying flour and a new set of hinges for the cellar door that was on the list. Their list now, hers and Ethan's, a thing. She thought of as ours, without quite registering that she was doing it. She was moving through the general store with her basket when she heard Thomas's voice. She had forgotten what it sounded like until she heard it again. He was near the back counter talking to 2 men she didn't know. His voice was the same as it had always been. Measured. Pleasant. The voice of a man who understood that tone does a lot of work, that content doesn't have to. She kept moving. She did not turn around. "Feel for Walker honestly," Thomas was saying. "He's a man trying to do right. But you bring a woman like that onto your property with that kind of history people talk. That's just how it is." One of the men murmured something she couldn't hear. "I tried," Thomas said, and his voice dipped into something that sounded like genuine sorrow. "God knows I tried. 7 years. You pray, you hope. But some things just aren't in God's plan for certain women. And when a man has a ranch to think about a future." Clara stopped moving. She was standing in the flower aisle, and she was very still. Every sensible instinct she had told her to keep walking, to take her things to the counter pay and leave, to not give him the audience he was working for, to not make a scene in a store that would talk about it for a month. She turned around. Thomas saw her immediately. The 2 men with him looked confused, then alert, then very interested. Thomas's expression arranged itself into something practiced, something that looked like tenderness and regret. "Clara," he said. "Thomas," she said. The store had gone quiet. Mr. Holt behind the counter had his hands flat on the surface and his eyes on the middle distance of a man who doesn't want to be a witness to anything. "I was just," Thomas began. "I heard what you were just," Clara said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of it. "I heard it perfectly well." Thomas looked at the 2 men beside him. A gesture. "See what I mean?" Then back to her. "Clara, I wasn't saying anything that wasn't true. I only ever wished you well." "I know you believe that," she said. "That's the most honest thing about you, Thomas. You've told your version of our story so many times that you actually think it's what happened." Thomas's pleasant expression shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. "You should be careful," he said low enough that the men beside him could still hear, "about burning bridges with people who were kind to you." Clara tilted her head and looked at him. "Kind," she said. The word alone. Then she picked up the hinges from the shelf she'd been standing in front of. She walked to the counter. She paid Mr. Holt, who took her money with his eyes down. She walked out of the store with her basket and her hinges and her flower and her spine as straight as a lodgepole pine. She got around the corner. She put her back against the wall of the building next door. She counted to 10. She breathed. Then she walked to the livery to collect the wagon. Noah from the livery. The original Noah, the 16-year-old, was waiting with the wagon already hitched. He had a look on his face that meant he'd heard something from someone who'd come in before her. "I'm fine," she said before he could speak. "You don't look fine," he said. "Then don't look at me," she said, and climbed onto the wagon. He handed her the reins. "For what it's worth," he said, "you've got more courage than anyone I've ever seen." She wanted to tell him that what he was calling courage was mostly just stubbornness. Instead, she said, "Thank you, Noah," and clicked the horse forward. She drove back to Red Hollow with her jaw set and the cold air against her face and the reins in hands that absolutely would not shake. Not on that road, not in front of the open fields and sky, not where anyone might possibly see. She told Ethan. Not immediately. She put the supplies away. She started supper. She ran through the numbers in her head of what she'd spent in town. She stayed busy. At the table that night, after the men had eaten and drifted off, after Noah had gone to his cot, after Gil had said goodnight with his usual economy of words, she and Ethan were alone with the remains of the meal and 2 cups of coffee and the particular quiet of a house settling down for the night. "I saw Thomas today," she said. Ethan looked up from the cup. She told him what happened, the store, the men, what Thomas had said, what she'd said back. When she finished, Ethan was quiet for a moment. "You turned around," he said. "I know, I shouldn't have." "I didn't say that." He paused. "What did he say when you spoke to him?" "He told me to be careful about burning bridges with people who'd been kind to me." She looked at her coffee. "He thinks of himself as someone who was kind to me." Ethan said nothing for a moment. Then, "Do you think there's any chance of him stopping the talking?" "No," Clara said, without hesitation. "He needs the story. He's about to marry a woman from Harlan County, and he needs to be the man who did everything right and was simply failed by circumstances." She looked up. "I am the circumstances." "Then we ignore him," Ethan said. "Ethan, he's talking to land assessors and county families. He's talking to the kind of people whose opinion affects whether your contracts get renewed, whether buyers want to deal with you at market." "Clara." He cut through it cleanly, not harshly. "I know." She stopped. He looked at her steady. "I know all of that. I've thought about it, and my answer is the same." He picked up his cup. "This ranch runs, or it doesn't, based on the work we do here, not on what Thomas Whitmore tells the Hales at their supper table." She stared at him. "You really believe that?" she said. "I've found," he said simply, "that when you spend your energy on the work in front of you, the noise behind you eventually runs out of something to say." Clara sat with that. Outside, the wind had changed direction. The air coming through the kitchen felt different, colder, like something coming. "My mother used to call it the first whisper of winter," she said without quite meaning to say it out loud. Ethan looked at her. She hadn't talked about her mother. Not to him. Not to anyone here. "Where was she from?" he said. Clara looked down at the table. "East Tennessee, a small town, same size as this one." "Is she?" "She died 4 years ago, about 3 months after Thomas left." Clara kept her voice flat. "Which meant I had no one to go home to and nowhere to go." A silence. "I'm sorry," Ethan said. "Not the automatic kind of sorry. The kind that carries weight." Clara nodded once. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "She would have had something to say about all of this," Clara said. She was plain-spoken. She didn't have much patience for cruelty dressed up as propriety. A pause. "She used to say that the worst thing people could do to you was make you feel ashamed of something that wasn't your fault. She said shame was a door that only locked from the outside." The quiet held for a moment. Ethan said, "She sounds like someone worth knowing." "She was," Clara said. "She would have liked you," she caught herself. "I mean, she respected direct people, people who said what they meant." He didn't make anything of it. He just nodded. "That's a good thing to be remembered for." Clara stood and began clearing the cups. "I should let you sleep," she said. "Clara." He said her name the way people say your name when they want you to know they're talking to you directly, not the air around you. "What he said in the store today, about certain women and God's plan." He paused. "That wasn't the truth. I want you to know I know that." She stood with the cups in her hands. "You don't know the whole story," she said. "I know enough," he said. "I know what I see. And what I see is a woman who has been carrying something that doesn't belong to her." Clara did not trust herself to respond to that. She said goodnight. She went to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands together and breathed carefully. The shame is a door that only locks from the outside. She thought about that for a long time. It was Gil who told her what happened at the feed store the following week. She hadn't been there, but Ethan had gone in for supplies on a Thursday morning, and Thomas Whitmore had been there, and apparently the two men had occupied the same space for the first time. Gil described it the way Gil described everything directly without embellishment, but with a preciseness that meant you got the whole picture. Whitmore started in, Gil said. "You know the way he talks, real smooth, like he's just stating facts." Said something about how he supposed Walker had found a situation at Red Hollow, with Clara's help, real polite, real pointed. "And," Clara said, "Walker just looked at him." Gil paused. Didn't say a word for a long moment, long enough that it got quiet. Then he said, and I'm telling you exactly how he said it. He said, "Whatever I've found at Red Hollow, I found it because of the quality of the people working there, including Mrs. Whitmore." Clara went very still. "Whitmore tried to keep going," Gil said. "Said something about hoping there weren't any problems, any difficulties arising from, his implication." What did Ethan say to that? Gil almost smiled. He said, "The only difficulty I can see is the one standing in front of me. And I've already handled that." Then he paid for his things and walked out. Clara stared at Gil. "In front of people," she said. "Mr. Holt. 2 farmhands from the Henderson property. The widow Kellerman." Gil nodded. Words already out. Clara sat down, slowly, at the kitchen table. It wasn't what Ethan had said. It wasn't even that he'd said it. It was that he had said it without asking her permission first, without making it a thing he needed credit for, without making it about himself. He had simply walked into a store and refused to participate in a story that wasn't true. And it had cost him something. She knew that. In a town like Willow Creek, that kind of statement cost a man something. People would take sides. Some of them would take the wrong one. And he had done it anyway, without telling her, without making her feel like she owed him. She found him in the barn at dusk. She walked in. He was working on a harness. He looked up. "Gil told me," she said. He looked back at the harness. "I figured. You didn't have to do that. I know. It's going to make things harder. With the Connollys, with the Hales. Clara." He set the harness down. He turned and faced her in the fading light. "If telling the truth about your worth makes things harder for me with people who are going to believe a lie instead, then those aren't people whose opinion was ever going to help me to begin with." She had rehearsed something to say on the walk from the house to the barn. She had thought through 3 different responses. She had prepared herself. None of it was useful now. She said the only thing she had left. "Why?" she said. Just the word. He looked at her for a long moment. The barn was quiet. Somewhere a horse shifted its weight. "Because it's right," he said. "That's not," she started. "And because," he said, and then he stopped. His jaw tightened. He looked like a man choosing words with the care of someone who's learned that words matter. "Because since you came here, this place has been a home instead of a camp. And Noah sleeps through the night now instead of sitting up. And the men are proud of their work instead of just doing it. And I wake up in the morning knowing that there's someone here who cares about the same things I care about." He looked at her directly. "That's not nothing." Clara stood in the barn doorway. Her chest hurt. Not in the way things that were broken hurt. In the way things that had been closed for a long time hurt when they began to open. "I don't know what to do with that," she said honestly. "You don't have to do anything with it," he said. "I'm not asking you for anything. I just wanted you to know why." She stood there for one more moment. Then she said, "Supper's in an hour," and walked back to the house. He said nothing. He went back to the harness. But when she reached the door of the house and pulled it open, she stopped for just a second. And for the first time in 4 years, she let herself want something. She wasn't sure yet what it was exactly. But it was warm, and it was real, and it lived in the direction of a man in a barn who had walked into a feed store and refused to let a lie go unchallenged. She went inside. She put supper on. And the ranch that night felt like the most permanent thing she'd stood on in years. The first snow came on a Wednesday. It didn't announce itself. One morning the ground was hard and bare, and by noon there was an inch on the fence posts and more coming. By nightfall, Red Hollow Ranch was locked inside something quiet and white and relentless, and Ethan was standing in the barn doorway, looking at the sky with the expression of a man doing fast arithmetic about things he couldn't control. Clara brought him coffee without being asked. He took it. He didn't look away from the sky. "How bad?" "Bad," she said. "Bad enough," he said. "The south shelter has a weak beam I've been meaning to replace. If we get another 4 inches on that roof, then we fix it tomorrow before 4 inches comes," she said. He looked at her sideways. "I know," she said. "I'm not a ranch hand." "I wasn't going to say that." "You were thinking it." He almost smiled. "I was thinking I'm glad you're not the kind of person who waits to be told what needs doing." She handed him the second cup she'd brought for herself. "Drink that. It's cold." He did. They stood in the barn doorway together for a moment, watching the snow come down in the dark. It was the kind of quiet that wasn't empty. The kind two people can stand inside without feeling the need to fill it up. Then Ethan said, "I need to get Gil and Russ on that beam first thing." "I'll have breakfast ready at 5, she said. 4:30, he said. She turned and walked back toward the house. Behind her, she heard him say quietly, not quite to her, but not away from her either, "I don't know what I'd do without you out here." She kept walking. She didn't respond, but her hand at her side pressed briefly into a fist. The way hands do when something moves through you that has nowhere else to go. They worked the beam the next morning in the dark and the cold, all 4 men up before the sun, and Clara in the barn with them, because the barn was where the work was. She wasn't swinging a hammer. She was handing tools, holding the lantern, keeping track of what needed doing next in the way she'd gotten good at, which was simply paying attention to everything at once. Noah. Their Noah was up on the beam itself. He was the lightest and the most sure-footed, and he'd volunteered before anyone could assign him, which was the kind of thing that made Gil look at him with the expression of a man who is watching a boy become something. It took 3 hours. The beam held. The shelter held. When they came back inside, snow-wet and cold-stiff and tired in the way that feels earned. Clara had a pot of something hot on the stove and bread on the table, and 4 dry towels stacked by the door. Russ picked up a towel and said, "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm going to tell every man I know that this is how a house is supposed to run." "You can tell them," Clara said, "but you might leave out that the whole operation started because a gate was banging." Gil sat down and looked at her with something she'd only recently learned to read on his face, which was respect delivered with absolute minimum visible emotion. Pete, the quietest of the 4, who had said perhaps 40 words to Clara in the 8 weeks she'd been at Red Hollow, sat down and said, "I wrote my sister about this place." Everyone looked at him. "I told her it finally feels like a real ranch," he said. He looked at his plate. "She asked if there was a woman running it. I said yes." A beat of silence. "What did she say?" Noah asked. "She said that explains it," Pete said. Clara turned back to the stove before anyone could see her face. The storm lasted 4 days. By the second day, the roads into Willow Creek were impassable, and the ranch was entirely its own world. There was something clarifying about that. When the outside couldn't get in, the inside had to be enough. And Clara discovered over those 4 days that Red Hollow was enough. The work was enough. The people were enough. They played cards after supper. Gil cheated with such professionalism that no one could ever catch him at it, which became its own kind of entertainment. Noah had a talent for games that involved pattern recognition that surprised everyone, including Noah. Russ told stories about ranches he'd worked that were worse than this, which, given Red Hollow's state of disrepair when they'd all arrived, was saying something. On the third night, it was just Clara and Ethan at the table after the others had gone to bed. They had gotten comfortable with this. The end of the evening, the two of them, the quiet. She had stopped being surprised by how natural it felt and started being careful about how much she'd come to rely on it. "Tell me about before this," she said. He looked up from the map he'd been studying. Supply routes, delivery schedules, the practical logistics of getting a ranch through its first winter. Before what? Before Red Hollow. Before Willow Creek. He was quiet for a moment. Not reluctant. Just measuring what he wanted to say and how. "I had a place in Colorado," he said. "Smaller than this. I ran it well, I thought." He paused. "I had a partner, business partner, man named Greer. We'd worked together for 6 years. I trusted him the way you trust someone after that long." Clara waited. "He had a gambling problem I didn't know about," Ethan said. "When I found out, he'd already mortgaged most of the operation against his debts, legally. I should have had protections in place. I didn't." He looked at the map. "I lost the property in 11 months. Everything I'd built." "I'm sorry," Clara said. "It was 3 years ago," he said. "I spent the first year being angry, the second year being careful, the third year finding Red Hollow." He looked up. "It's not a story I tell much." "Why are you telling me?" He met her eyes. "Because you told me about your mother." She understood. The quiet exchange of things that cost something to say. The way trust is actually built, not in one declaration, but in these small deposits, one at a time. "Greer," she said. "Do you still think about him?" "Less than I used to," Ethan said. "I spent a long time angry at him, and then I spent some time being angry at myself for not seeing it. Now mostly, I just think he had a problem he couldn't face, and I got caught in the fallout." A pause. "That's not simple, but it's closer to the truth than most of the versions I told myself." Clara looked at him. "That's very fair," she said. "Most people don't get there." "Most people don't lose a ranch," he said dryly. She laughed. It came out before she could think about whether to let it, quick and genuine. And then she was slightly startled by the sound of herself laughing, because she couldn't quite remember the last time. Ethan looked at her with something warm and careful in his expression. She sobered. "I haven't done that in a while," she said. "Laughed like that, like I meant it." He said nothing. But he was looking at her the way he'd looked at her that first Sunday in church. Not studying her, not performing interest, just seeing her, fully, without flinching. Clara looked down at the table. "I should let you work," she said. "Clara," he said. She looked up. "It's all right," he said. "Just that." It covers a lot of ground, those 3 words, when someone says them the right way. She went to bed with the sound of her own laughter still sitting somewhere in her chest, strange and warming like a fire that had been banked for years and was just now remembering what it was for. The storm broke on this morning of the 4th day, and the first thing that came through when the roads cleared was a rider from town. He was one of the Henderson boys, 17, sent by his father on an errand that he was clearly uncomfortable with. He handed Clara a folded note at the front door and wouldn't quite meet her eyes. She opened it. It was from Ruth Edna Marsh's daughter-in-law. Not Edna herself. "Ruth," it said. "Clara, I don't know if this is my place, but Thomas has been speaking with Arthur Hale this week about the Red Hollow property. I am not sure of the particulars, but I believe it concerns questions of the land title. I thought you should know. Don't tell Edna I wrote. R." Clara read it twice. She folded it. She put it in her apron pocket. She thanked the Henderson boy. She gave him a biscuit for the cold ride. She closed the door. She stood in the front room for exactly 30 seconds. Then she went to find Ethan. How was in the far field checking the fence line that had come through the storm. She walked out to him. He saw her coming and read something in her pace because he came toward her rather than waiting. She handed him the note without saying anything. He read it. His jaw tightened incrementally. Arthur Hale, he said. Not a question. The land assessor, she said. His wife Margaret was with Edna when they came out here. I know who he is. He folded the note. He held it for a moment. Then he said very calmly, Thomas is trying to find a problem with the title. Why? Ethan looked at her. Because I embarrassed him in the feed store. And because the story he's been telling about you doesn't work anymore if this ranch succeeds while you're on it. Clara absorbed that. What does he want? She said. What does he actually want out of this? He wants me to let you go, Ethan said. He wants you back in the back pew with nothing to your name and no one standing beside you. Because that version of you confirms the version of himself he needs to keep believing. It was the most direct he had ever been about Thomas. Not angry exactly, but clear in the way that is sometimes more powerful than anger. Can he actually do anything with the title? She asked. I don't know yet, he said, but I'm going to find out. He put the note in his coat pocket. I needed to go into town. Ethan. Not to confront him, he said. To talk to the land office, quietly, before he has time to do whatever he's planning to do. He started toward the barn. Take Gil with you, she said. He stopped, turned. Gil knows people in town that you don't yet, she said. He's been here longer. He has relationships with men that Thomas doesn't have leverage over. Take him. Ethan looked at her for a moment. All right, he said. He left within the hour, Gil beside him on the wagon, both of them moving with the particular quietness of men on a mission they haven't fully articulated yet. Clara watched them go. Then she went inside, and she did the work in front of her, because that was what you did when there was nothing else you could control. She cleaned, she organized. She made a new list. She checked the supply of winter stores and calculated how long they'd last against what she knew of their usage patterns. She kept her hands busy so her mind couldn't go too far down the road Ethan and Gil had just taken. They came back at 5 in the afternoon. The look on Gil's face when they walked through the door was not the look of a man bringing good news, but it was also not the look of disaster. It was the look of something complicated. Sit down, Ethan said. Clara sat. The two men sat across from her. The title is clean, Ethan said. There's no problem with the land. Whatever Thomas told Hale, there's no actual legal basis for any challenge. Clara released a breath. But, Gil said. She looked at him. Thomas has been talking to more than Hale, Gil said. He's been talking to the cattle buyers consortium that covers the spring market. He's been telling people that Red Hollow is an unstable operation. Gil glanced at Ethan. He's been specific about why he thinks it's unstable. Me, Clara said. He's saying Walker hired a woman with a troubled history, and it reflects poor judgment about how the ranch is being run. He's suggesting that buyers would be taking a risk contracting with an operation managed this way. Gil's jaw was set. He clearly did not enjoy delivering this. It's not legal interference, but if the right buyers believe it before spring. We lose contracts, Ethan said. You might lose contracts, Gil said. I'm not saying you will. I'm saying it's what he's working toward. The table was quiet. Clara looked at her hands. She felt the particular weight of being someone whose existence cost the people around her something. She had felt it before. She had felt it every time Thomas had added another stone to the story he was building about her. But this was different. This wasn't just her reputation. This was Ethan's livelihood. These were Gil's wages, and Russ's, and Pete's, and Noah's. I could leave, she said. Both men looked at her. If I'm not here, she said, keeping her voice flat. He doesn't have a story. The operation stabilizes in his telling of it. The buyers have nothing to question. Ethan said no. Just the word, completely final. Ethan. No, he said again. That is not the solution. Listen to me. Clara. He leaned forward. He put his forearms on the table. He looked at her with an expression that left no room for argument, not because it was hard, but because it was absolutely certain. If we let him win by making you disappear, then we're telling him his story is right. We're telling this town his story is right. And we're telling you that his story is right. He shook his head. I'm not doing that. Clara pressed her lips together. This is my decision, she said. And this is my ranch, he said. And you are... He stopped. He looked at the table for 1 second, then back at her. You are not a problem to be solved. You are the reason this place is standing. I need you to understand that I know that even if no one else does yet. The kitchen was very quiet. Gil had found something extremely interesting to look at on the far wall. Clara said, "What do you propose instead?" Ethan sat back. We go to the spring market, and we let the buyers see the operation for themselves. Numbers don't lie. If the books are clean, and the cattle are healthy, and the ranch is running right, then Thomas Whitmore is just a man talking. And between now and spring, she said. Between now and spring, he said, we work. Like we've been doing. Better than we've been doing. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about this back pew. She thought about what she'd told Noah, that disappearing was what they wanted. That the worst thing you could do was act like you didn't matter. She had said those words. She needed to be the person who meant them. All right, she said. Ethan nodded once. Gil stood up. I'll tell the men, he said. They should know what's coming. Tell them they have a job as long as this ranch stands, Ethan said. Nothing about that has changed. Gil went out. The door closed. In the silence that followed, Clara looked at Ethan and said, You're not afraid of him. Of Thomas. He considered it. No. Why not? He has relationships in this county that go back decades. You've been here 8 months. Ethan looked at her steadily. Because he's trying to protect a lie. And lies take constant maintenance. The truth just sits there. He picked up his cup. I'd rather put my energy into the thing that doesn't need constant repair. Clara thought my mother would have loved this man. She didn't say it, but she thought it completely. It was 2 days later that the twist came. The one that changed everything. Not from Thomas. Not from Edna Marsh or Arthur Hale or any of the people Clara had been watching and bracing against. It came from Dr. Samuel Pratt, who was 67 years old, had been Willow Creek's physician for 30 years, and was the kind of man who had seen enough of humanity's business to know that most of it was better left alone. He was not a gossip. He was not a man who involved himself in other people's affairs. He had in fact made a career of not doing so, which made it all the more significant when he rode out to Red Hollow Ranch on a Thursday afternoon and asked to speak with Clara privately. She brought him into the front room. Ethan was out. They sat across from each other in the 2 chairs by the window. Dr. Pratt held his hat in both hands and looked at her the way a person looks at someone they owe something to. I've been thinking about coming to see you for 2 years, he said. I kept deciding it wasn't my place. He paused. I've changed my mind about that. Clara waited. When you and Thomas were married, he said carefully, he came to see me in the 3rd year. He was concerned about... He stopped, chose his words. He came with questions about why there had been no children. Clara went very still. I conducted an examination, Dr. Pratt said. I asked to examine you as well. Do you remember that I sent a note to the house? Clara thought back. 7 years was a long time. But she did remember something. A note. She'd asked Thomas about it. Thomas told me it wasn't necessary, she said slowly. Yes, Dr. Pratt said. He told me the same. He said you preferred not to be seen about it, that you were modest and it wasn't required. He looked at his hat. I accepted that. I shouldn't have. I've thought about that many times. Clara's heart was very quiet in her chest, the way things go quiet right before something large. What did your examination of Thomas show? She said. Dr. Pratt looked up at her. His expression was the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and is only now setting it down. It showed, he said, that there was a physical reason the marriage had not produced children, and that the reason was not yours. The room did not move. Clara did not move. You're saying, she started. I'm saying that what Thomas told this town about you was not medically supported, Dr. Pratt said. I cannot say with certainty what you could or couldn't have. Medicine doesn't work with certainties. But I can say that the story he told, the specific story that you lacked, that was not a conclusion I ever reached about you. And it was not a conclusion he had any medical basis for. Clara stared at him. "Why are you telling me this now?" she said. Her voice was very controlled. "Because he's at it again," Dr. Pratt said. "He's telling the same story to new people. He's attaching it to your situation here, to questions about this ranch. And I am old enough to know that if I don't say something now, I will still be thinking about it in another 2 years. And I've run out of patience for my own cowardice on the matter." He looked her directly in the eye. "I am sorry, Mrs. Whitmore. I should have come to you years ago. I made a choice that was easier for me than it was right, and I have known that." Clara sat in the chair and felt something very complicated move through her body. Not triumph. Not the hot rush of being vindicated. Something quieter and more complicated. The grief of understanding that a single decision, a doctor accepting a husband's refusal, had cost her 4 years of being someone that a whole town had decided was broken. "Does anyone else know?" she said. "No one else has ever known," he said. "I took an oath of confidentiality. I'm here because I believe there are moments when silence becomes its own kind of harm." Clara stood up. She walked to the window. She stood with her back to him for a moment. She was thinking about the last pew, about Edna Marsh's careful smile, about Martha Connolly leaning over and saying you might be more comfortable toward the back, dear, about Thomas's voice in the feed store saying some things just aren't in God's plan for certain women, about 7 years of marriage and 4 years of being a verdict, about a story that had never been true. She turned around. "What do you want to do with this information?" she said. Dr. Pratt looked at her steadily. "That is entirely your decision. I will say whatever you need me to say to whoever you need me to say it, or I will say nothing further. I came because you deserve to know the truth. What you do with it belongs to you." Clara looked at him for a long time. "Give me a few days," she said. He nodded. He stood. He put on his hat. At the door he stopped. He said without turning around, "You are not what Thomas Whitmore said you were. You never were." He left. Clara stood in the front room alone. She didn't cry. She had done enough crying in this life over things that weren't her fault. She sat back down in the chair. She sat there for a long time. When Ethan came through the door an hour later, he took one look at her face and sat down in the chair across from her. He didn't ask right away. That was something she'd learned about him. He knew the difference between a silence you interrupt and a silence you sit with. After a moment she said, "Dr. Pratt came to see me today." She told him everything, exactly as it had been said in the same order, without omitting anything. When she finished, Ethan was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Clara." "Don't," she said quickly. "Don't tell me you're sorry or that it isn't fair. I know both of those things already, and right now I need to think, not feel." He closed his mouth. She looked at him. "What I need to know," she said, "is whether this changes anything. About you. About how you see this situation. About what you told me that I wasn't what Thomas said I was." She held his gaze. "I need to know if that was something you believed on faith, or something you believe because you knew." He looked at her without flinching. "I believed it on faith," he said, "because I know what I saw when I watched you work. I know what kind of person builds the things you've built here." He leaned forward slightly. "The doctor's information changes what the town has to reckon with. It doesn't change a single thing I already knew about you." Clara held his gaze. She believed him. She believed him the way you believe things that have been proven slowly over time by consistent evidence. "I need to decide," she said. "Take whatever time you need," he said. She nodded. She stood. She went to the kitchen. She put the kettle on. She stood at the stove with her back to the room and thought about Thomas and the doctor and 7 years in a back pew and a man who had walked through a church door and sat beside her because he saw her as a person worth sitting next to. She thought about what it would mean to speak and what it would mean to stay silent. And then she thought about Noah, 17 years old, sitting at a table he'd been afraid to claim, saying the worst thing you can do when people treat you like you don't matter is act like you don't. The kettle began to whistle. Clara lifted it from the stove. She had decided. She slept on it. Not because she was uncertain. She had made her decision the moment the kettle whistled, and she lifted it from the stove. But she had learned something in 4 years of surviving this town, which was that decisions made in the heat of the moment were decisions you sometimes had to unmake. So she waited one night. She let the morning come. She made breakfast. She watched the men eat. She watched Noah pour himself a second cup of coffee with the ease of someone who had stopped counting whether he deserved it. And when the morning confirmed what the night had decided, she went to find Ethan. He was in the barn. He had developed a habit of being useful in the barn when he sensed she needed room to think, which was its own kind of consideration, making himself available without crowding her. She had started to understand that this was just how he was. He moved through space with awareness of other people's need for it. "I've decided," she said. He set down what he was working on. He turned. He waited. "I'm going to speak to Pastor Mills," she said. "I want Dr. Pratt to tell the truth, not in a spectacle, not to humiliate Thomas publicly, but in front of the people who matter most, the ones whose opinion built the story in the first place." She paused. "And I want to be standing there when he does it." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "Are you sure?" he said. "I've been waiting 4 years for someone to tell the truth," she said. "I'm done waiting for someone else to start." He nodded. Once, solid and certain. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to stand beside me," she said. He looked at her with that expression she had stopped being able to name because it had too many things in it. "I've been doing that," he said quietly. "I know," she said. "I'm asking you to keep doing it." She went to see Pastor Mills that same afternoon. He was a decent man. She had always believed that about him, even when decency hadn't been enough to make him act. He was the kind of man who meant well and waited too long, which was a particular kind of failing she understood, because she had once done it herself. He opened the door of the parsonage and looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between guilt and relief, as if he'd been expecting this visit and wasn't sure whether to be glad it had finally come. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Pastor Mills," she said. "I'd like to talk to you about Sunday." He stepped back. He let her in. They sat across from each other in his study. Clara told him everything. She was direct, and she was measured, and she did not cry. She told him about Thomas's story and what it had cost her. She told him about Dr. Pratt's visit. She told him what she wanted and exactly why she wanted it. When she finished, Pastor Mills was quiet for a long moment. "Clara," he said. He had never called her Clara. He had always said Mrs. Whitmore with the careful distance of a man keeping his options open. "I owe you an apology." "You do," she said, simply. He flinched slightly. Not with offense, with recognition. "I saw what was happening in this congregation. I chose not to see it clearly. I told myself it wasn't my place to intervene in the private affairs of a marriage." He looked at his hands. "That was cowardice dressed as discretion." "Yes," she said, another flinch. "You're not going to make this easy for me." "No," she said. "I'm not. I was easy for 4 years, and it didn't help either of us." He almost smiled. Then he said, "What exactly are you asking of me?" "I'm asking you to allow Dr. Pratt to speak in church on Sunday, before the service, formally, with the congregation present." She held his gaze. "The story was built in this community. It needs to be corrected in this community. And Thomas," he said, "he's planning to be in church Sunday. He's attending with the woman he's bringing from Harlan County." Clara had not known that. She felt it move through her, a cold ripple, and then she steadied herself. "Good," she said. Mills blinked. "Good. If he's there," she said, "then he hears it too. That's not my intention, but I'm not going to adjust my timing around his comfort." Pastor Mills looked at her for a long moment. He was reassessing something. She could see it happening in real time. "You've changed," he said. "No," she said. "I've stopped being careful about hiding who I actually am." She stood. "Will you give Dr. Pratt 5 minutes before the service on Sunday?" He stood too. He held out his hand. "I'll give him as long as he needs," he said. She shook it. She walked out into the cold afternoon, and her hands at her sides were perfectly steady. Oh. The next 2 days at Red Hollow were strange. Not bad, just charged. The way air gets before a storm, like everything is holding its breath. The men sensed something was coming without knowing what. Gil watched Clara with his careful, sideways attention. Pete stayed close to the house, which was unusual for him. Russ asked twice if there was anything extra that needed doing, which meant he wanted to be useful and didn't know how. Noah knew more than the others, because Noah paid attention to everything and had developed an instinct for Clara's face that was almost maternal in its precision, which was quietly ironic, given that he was 17 and she was 38. He found her on Friday evening sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. She wasn't drinking, looking at the wall. He sat down across from her without asking. She looked at him. "Sunday," he said. It wasn't a question. "Sunday," she confirmed. Howe was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you scared?" She considered the question seriously, the way she always considered his questions, because he deserved that. "A little," she said. He nodded. "That makes sense." A pause. "Are you going to do it anyway?" "Yes." He looked at the table, then back at her. "My mother used to say that doing the right thing scared is still doing the right thing." Clara looked at him. "She said a lot of good things," Clara said. "She had a lot of good things to say," he agreed. Then quietly, "I think she would have liked you." Clara pressed her lips together, tight, for exactly 2 seconds. "Go to bed, Noah," she said, her voice slightly rougher than usual. He got up. He went to the door. He stopped. "Clara," he said, "whatever happens Sunday, whatever people say, we all know what's true." He looked at her directly. "This whole ranch knows what's true." He went to bed. Clara sat at the table for a long time after that. Saturday evening. Ethan came to find her. She was in the kitchen, always the kitchen. It was the place where her hands could work while her mind did other things, and he came in and sat down at the table and said, "I need to tell you something." She turned from the stove. His expression was the expression of a man who has been debating whether to say something and has finally arrived on the side of saying it. "What?" she said. He looked at the table, then up at her. "Thomas came to see me today." Clara felt every muscle in her body go very still. "When?" she said. "This afternoon, while you were in town." "What did he say?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "He said he'd heard I was planning to attend church Sunday with you. He said he wanted to speak to me man to man before that happened." A pause. "He said, and I want you to hear this exactly as he said it. He said, 'I understand you have feelings for that woman, but you should know what you're actually dealing with before you make a fool of yourself in front of the county.'" Clara exhaled slowly. "And what did you say?" she said. "I told him that the only fool I could see was a man who had traveled back to a town he'd left specifically to interfere in the life of a woman he'd already hurt enough." Ethan's voice was controlled, but something beneath it was not. "Then I told him to get off my property." Clara stared at him. "He left," Ethan said. "But before he did, he said something else." He paused. He said, "She'll never give you what a man needs from a wife. I know that firsthand." The kitchen was very quiet. "He still believes it," Clara said, mostly to herself. "He has to believe it," Ethan said. "If he stops believing it, the last 7 years of his life look entirely different." Clara turned back to the stove. She stood there for a moment with her back to him. "Ethan," she said. "Yes." She turned. "When he said you had feelings for me." She held his gaze. "He was right about that, wasn't he?" It wasn't quite a question. Ethan looked at her steadily. He didn't look away. He didn't rearrange his expression into something safer. "Yes," he said, simply. Clara stood across the kitchen from him. All the things she had been keeping carefully on the back shelf of herself. Things she had put there because she'd learned the hard way that wanting things could be used against you, all of it came forward at once. "I don't know how to trust that," she said. "Honest. Painful. Necessary." "I know," he said. The last time someone said things that sounded like this. I know, he said again. I'm not asking you to trust the words. I'm asking you to watch what I do. He leaned forward slightly. Have I done anything in 4 months that you couldn't trust? She thought about it. She thought about the feed store, about the note from Ruth, about the night he'd said let him talk with such absolute certainty, about driving out to the land office with Gil, about never once making her feel like a charity case, not once, not even in the smallest way. No, she said. Then keep watching, he said. That's all I'm asking. Clara stood in the kitchen that she had made into a real kitchen, in the house she had made into a real home on the ranch that was becoming something, because people here had decided it mattered. She said, "Ask me again after Sunday." Ethan looked at her, a question in his face. "Whatever you were going to ask me," she said, "ask me after Sunday. When this is over and you know who I am without the weight of Thomas Whitmore's story in the room." She held his gaze. "Ask me when I'm just myself." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right." He got up. He went to the door. He stopped. "For what it's worth," he said without turning around. "I already know who you are. Sunday isn't going to change anything for me." He went out. Clara stood at the stove and breathed carefully. For what it's worth, she thought. Everything, she thought. That's worth everything. Sunday morning came cold and clear. Clara dressed in the best dress she owned, which was better than it had been 4 years ago, because she had let herself buy a decent dress when the wages from Red Hollow had made it possible. She did her hair with care. She put on her good coat. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand. The woman looking back at her was 38 years old and had survived things that would have ended other people, and was about to walk into a church and stand in the truth of her own life in front of the people who had decided who she was. She said quietly to the mirror, "All right, Mama. One more day." Then she went downstairs. Ethan was waiting in the front room. He had dressed carefully too in his good coat, his hat in his hands in that way he had. He looked at her when she came down, and he said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Ready?" "Yes," she said. Gil and Noah were waiting outside. Both of them had dressed in their Sunday clothes, which for Gil was an act of particular significance, because Gil expressed his feelings through actions, and this was the cleanest statement of allegiance she could have asked for. Russ and Pete were there too. All of them. Clara looked at the 5 of them. She said, "You don't have to come." Gil said, "We know." That was all. They got in the wagon. The church was full. It was always full on winter Sundays when there was little else to do, and the building was one of the warmer places in town. But today, it felt fuller than usual, which meant word had gotten around that something was going to happen the way word always got around in a town this size. People who might have stayed home had found reasons to come. Clara walked in with Ethan on one side and Noah on the other, and Gil and Russ and Pete behind her, and the church did what it always did. It went quiet in that particular way that meant everyone had turned to look. She walked all the way to the front. Not the second pew. Not the third. The front. She sat down with her back straight and her hands in her lap, and she looked at the altar, and she breathed. Ethan sat beside her, his arm close enough to hers that she could feel the warmth of it. Somewhere behind her, she heard the particular quality of silence that means a specific person has registered what they're seeing. She knew without looking that Thomas was in the church. She had known he would be. She did not look behind her. Pastor Mills came to the front. He cleared his throat. He looked out at the congregation with the expression of a man who has made a decision he knows is right and is walking toward it regardless. "Before we begin this morning's service," he said, "Dr. Samuel Pratt has asked to address the congregation on a matter of some importance. I have agreed to this." He paused. "I'd ask for your respectful attention." The murmuring that had been running through the church like a quiet current went still. Dr. Pratt stood up from the front pew where he'd been seated. He was 67 years old, and he walked to the front of that church with the deliberate weight of a man who has decided that being late is not the same as being wrong. He stood. He looked at the congregation. He said, I have been a physician in this town for 30 years. In that time, I have kept the confidences of everyone in this room, as is my duty and my oath." He paused. "Today, I am here because I believe that a confidence kept too long has become instead a harm. And I am old enough to know that correcting a harm late is better than not correcting it." The church was absolutely silent. Clara stared at the altar. She breathed. "7 years ago," Dr. Pratt said, "I examined Thomas Whitmore. I won't speak to the particulars of that examination beyond what is necessary. What is necessary is the story this town has told about Clara Whitmore. The story that she was somehow at fault for the state of her marriage was never a conclusion I reached. It was never supported by medicine. It was never my finding." His voice was steady and clear. What this town accepted as established fact was one man's explanation for a situation he preferred not to look at too closely, and I permitted it by my silence. He stopped. Clara heard something behind her, a sharp intake of breath, then murmuring. Then a voice, Thomas's voice, beginning to say something that was immediately hushed by the sheer collective pressure of a room full of people who had heard something they needed to sit with. Dr. Pratt looked directly at Clara. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I am sorry. I should have said this years ago. I did not. That is my failure, and I own it." Clara met his eyes. She nodded once. Dr. Pratt sat down. The church remained in the particular silence of people who have just been told that something they believed completely was not true, and are now having to rearrange everything they thought they knew. Pastor Mills came back to the front. He looked as though he had more to say, had perhaps prepared something, but he looked out at his congregation and seemed to decide that the moment had said enough. Then from the back of the church, a voice. Thomas's voice. "This is an outrage." Everyone turned. Clara did not. "He has no right." Thomas was standing now, she could tell by the direction of the sound. "This is a private matter, a medical matter, and he has no right." Thomas. Pastor Mills's voice was quiet, but it landed hard. "Please sit down." "I will not sit down while a man stands in this church and makes accusations." No accusations were made. It was Ethan's voice. Calm. Completely certain. He hadn't stood up. He said it to the altar in front of him, as clearly as if he were saying it directly to Thomas's face. "A correction was made. There's a difference." The church went still again. Thomas said nothing. Clara felt Ethan's arm, the outside of it, pressed gently against hers. Just that. Just the warmth of it. She breathed. After the service, the church did not empty the way it usually did. People gathered in small groups the way people do when they have a great deal to process and need witnesses to process it with. There was the low, sustained murmur of people saying things to each other that would take days to fully say. Clara stood near the front, and people came to her. Not everyone. Some people left quickly and deliberately, which was its own kind of statement. She filed away without dwelling on. But others came. More than she expected. Edna Marsh came. Clara had not expected that. Edna was a woman who had built her position in this town on always knowing which way the wind was blowing before it blew. And the wind in that church had just changed direction completely. But when she stood in front of Clara, Clara saw something she hadn't expected to see on Edna's face. Not calculation, not careful realignment of social position. Shame. Real shame. The kind that doesn't perform itself. "Clara," Edna said. Clara waited. Edna's jaw worked for a moment. She was a woman who did not apologize easily. This was visible in every line of her face. "I should have..." She stopped. "I was not..." She stopped again. Then very quietly, "I'm sorry. I am genuinely sorry for what I allowed to happen in my presence. For 4 years. Clara looked at her for a long moment. "I know," she said. Then, because it was true, and because she was done letting unfinished things sit between people, "I accept that." Edna's eyes went slightly bright. She pressed her lips together. She nodded. She moved away. Ruth appeared beside Clara almost immediately after. Ruth, who had sent that note. Who had risked Edna's disapproval to warn her about Thomas and the land assessor. You knew, Clara said quietly. You knew something wasn't right about the story. Ruth looked at her hands. I suspected. I had no right to. She shook her head. I was afraid of her opinion, of what she would say if I. She stopped. I sent the note. You did, Clara said. That mattered. I want you to know that. Ruth looked at her with the expression of someone who has received something they weren't sure they deserved. Thank you, she said. Margaret Hale came and stood at a distance and gave Clara a look that was somewhere between acknowledgement and apology, then moved on without speaking, which was about as much as Clara expected from that particular direction. The Henderson boy's father came and shook her hand and said something about hoping there were no hard feelings, which was a sentence that meant approximately nothing, but was delivered with enough sincerity that she accepted it at face value. She was standing near the door, beginning to feel the length of the morning in her legs, when she heard Thomas's voice one last time. He was near the back of the church talking to two men she didn't know. His voice had the tight, controlled quality of a man trying very hard to hold a narrative together that is coming apart in his hands. She caught fragments. Out of context. Doctor had no right. Pratt's always had it in for me. She turned. She walked toward him. He saw her coming. The two men he was talking to saw her coming and made the fast, instinctive decision of men who sense a situation and decide not to be part of it. They moved away. Thomas was alone when she reached him. He looked at her with the expression she recognized from 7 years of marriage, the one that meant he was angry and was managing it beneath a surface of reasonable concern. Clara, he said, I hope you're satisfied. I'm not here for satisfaction, she said. I'm here to say one thing to you, and then I'm done. He waited, his arms crossed, his face arranged in the composure of a man who is sure he can handle whatever comes. You needed a story, she said. I understand that now better than I did. You needed someone else to be the reason things didn't go the way you planned. That's human. It's a very human thing. She held his gaze. But the story cost me 4 years of my life. It cost me my mother's last months because I couldn't go to her without bringing the shame of it with me. It cost me standing in a room and feeling like something failed. She didn't raise her voice. She kept it exactly even. I am not telling you that to punish you. I am telling you because I think somewhere inside you, you know it. And you're going to have to live with knowing it long after today is over. Thomas was quiet. His jaw was set. His eyes were doing something she couldn't entirely read, not quite remorse, but adjacent to it, adjacent to the possibility of it. I thought what I thought, he said. His voice was lower than it had been, almost to himself. I know, she said. That's the part that cost the most. She stepped back. I hope you find something real to build on, Thomas. I genuinely do. She turned and walked away. She was shaking by the time she reached the door. Not from fear, from the release of something she'd been holding for 4 years, and now it had left her body, and the space it left was enormous and terrifying and clean. Ethan was waiting just outside. He looked at her face and said nothing. He simply fell into step beside her as she walked down the church steps and out into the cold, clear morning. They walked for a moment in silence. Then he said, All right. Ask me in about an hour, she said. He almost smiled. Fair enough. They reached the wagon where Gil and Noah and Russ and Pete were waiting with the careful stillness of people who know that something important has just happened and are giving it the room it needs. Noah looked at Clara. She looked at Noah. You good, he said. Getting there, she said. He nodded like that was the right answer. They drove back to Red Hollow in the quiet of a winter morning that had stopped feeling like it was full of something waiting to happen. The charged quality was gone. The air was just air, cold and sharp and clean. Clara sat beside Ethan on the wagon seat and felt the particular exhaustion of someone who has done a hard, necessary thing and is only now beginning to know it's finished. When they got back to the ranch, the men went about their business with the tact of people who understood that this particular afternoon needed space. Gil found something to do in the barn. Pete and Russ went to check the south fence. Noah disappeared in the direction of the horses. Ethan brought the wagon around to the side of the house. Clara sat on the seat for a moment after he climbed down. He reached up and offered his hand. She took it and climbed down. She kept his hand for just a moment after her feet touched the ground. Then she let go. "Inside," she said. "Coffee." They went inside. She put the kettle on. She took off her good coat. She moved around the kitchen with the automatic ease of someone who knows every inch of a space and has learned to trust it. When she turned around with the cups, Ethan was sitting at the table, watching her with the same look she'd seen in that church on the very first Sunday when he'd asked if he could sit beside her. The look that was just seeing her. Straight and clear and without anything complicated attached to it. "You said to ask you after Sunday," he said. Clara set the cups on the table. She sat down. She looked at him across the table that had become the center of a home she had built with her own hands. "I remember," she said. He leaned forward, his forearms on the table, his eyes on hers. "I'm not a man who has easy things to offer," he said. "I've got a ranch that's been hard going, and a past that has some rough patches, and a personality that most people find difficult to read." He paused. "But I know what I have here. I know what we've built. And I know how I feel about the person who made it possible." Clara said nothing. "I would like," he said carefully, "the right to keep sitting beside you, not just at that church. Here, in this kitchen, on this ranch, in whatever comes next." He held her gaze. "I would like that to be a permanent thing if you're willing." Clara looked at him. 4 years, a back pew, a town that had decided who she was, a man who had walked through a door and chosen to see something different. She thought, this is what it feels like when something is real. "Yes," she said. He didn't move for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "Yeah." "Yes," she said again. A little firmer, a little warmer, with the particular certainty of a woman who has spent 4 years being careful and has decided to be done with that particular version of herself. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held it. The kettle was somewhere behind her beginning to whistle. Neither of them moved to answer it. They told the men that evening at supper. Ethan said it simply the way he said everything, that he and Clara were going to be married when she was ready, when they were both ready, and that he wanted them to know. The table was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then Noah said with the absolute deadpan of someone who has seen it coming for weeks, "Finally." Gil looked at the ceiling. Russ hit Noah on the shoulder. Pete smiled. It was the largest smile Clara had ever seen on Pete's face. It transformed his entire expression. "About time," Pete said, which was astonishing for a man who averaged 3 words per day. Clara laughed. The real kind. The kind she'd recovered in that kitchen during the storm, the kind that came from somewhere genuine. And the sound of it filled the room, and Ethan looked at her across the table with the expression of a man who has found something he was not expecting and intends to take very good care of it. That night, after the dishes were done, and the men had gone to their cots, and the ranch was quiet in the deep way. It got after a hard day. Clara sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and wrote a letter. She hadn't written many letters. There hadn't been many people to write to. She addressed this one to the one person she had wished could have been in that church. The one person who had told her that shame was a door that only locked from the outside. The one person who would have understood completely, and without a word of explanation, what today had meant. She wrote, "Mama, I want to tell you what happened today. I want to tell you about the man who first sat beside me when no one else would. I want to tell you that you were right, the door is open. I walked through it, and on the other side was everything worth having." She folded the letter. She didn't have anywhere to send it. But she had written it, and that mattered, because her mother had always said that the truth was worth speaking, even when no one was there to hear it. Especially then. She set it down on the table. She looked around the kitchen. At the clean pans on the shelf. At the organized larder she had built from chaos. At the window that showed the dark and the stars above the ridge. At the home she had made from nothing with her own hands, in a place no one had expected her to succeed. She said quietly to no one and to everything, "One more day." Then she smiled. Because tomorrow was going to be better than today, and the day after that was going to be better still. And she knew it in the way you only know things that have been earned fully and completely through everything it cost to get there. They married in April, not because April was the most convenient month, and not because the snow had fully cleared and the roads were good, though both those things were true. They married in April because Clara had decided that the best time to begin something real was when the world was in the process of becoming itself again. When the ground was soft and the air was changing and everything that had survived the winter was pushing upward toward the light. Ethan had asked her once what kind of wedding she wanted. She had thought about it for exactly 4 seconds and said, "The same church, the same pew, and the people who actually showed up when it mattered." He had said, "That's it." She had said, "That's everything." So that was what they had. The church was full. Not in the way it had been full on the Sunday. Dr. Pratt spoke with the charged electricity of people who had come to watch something happen. This was different. This was the fullness of people who had come because they wanted to be there. Because somewhere between that Sunday and this April morning, something had shifted in Willow Creek. Not all the way, not completely, because towns don't change all the way, and Clara had stopped expecting that, but enough. Enough that when she walked through those doors, the heads that turned did so with warmth instead of judgment. Gil sat in the front row. He was wearing a coat she had never seen before, and had clearly purchased specifically for this occasion, which was the most extravagant emotional gesture she had ever witnessed from him. Russ and Pete were beside him. Pete had combed his hair in a way that suggested considerable effort. Noah sat at the end of the row. He was 18 now. He had grown an inch over the winter and had the look of someone who was becoming steadily and surely the person he was going to be. He looked at Clara when she came in, and his face did something complicated and genuine that he didn't try to hide. She touched his shoulder as she passed. He covered her hand with his briefly. Then let go. That was all. That was enough. Pastor Mills performed the ceremony with the particular care of a man who understands that this moment carries more weight than most, and who is trying in whatever way is available to him to make up for the weight he failed to carry before. He spoke about commitment without conditions, about the kind of love that doesn't require the other person to prove themselves before it's offered, about what it meant to choose someone, not because the world agreed with your choice, but because you knew what you were looking at. Clara stood beside Ethan and listened to these words and thought, "You should have said some of this 4 years ago," but she let it go. Letting things go was something she had gotten better at, not forgetting, not pretending it hadn't happened, just choosing not to carry it into the room she was walking toward. When Ethan took her hand, his grip was steady and warm and entirely certain. She looked at him. He looked at her. He said his vows in the quiet, direct way. He said everything, not performing them for the room, just saying them to her. Like a man reporting the truth of what he knew. "I will stand beside you. I will not need you to earn your place. I will choose this every day without requiring the world's agreement." When she said hers, her voice was clear and steady, and she meant every word so completely that the meaning of the words themselves felt almost insufficient. Language was an approximation. What she actually felt had no name in any language she knew. It was just this. Yes. Here. Finally. Pastor Mills said, "You may." Ethan was already looking at her with a small private smile. She put her free hand on his face and kissed him. And the church did the thing that churches do when something real and long overdue happens inside them. It released a sound that was half laughter and half something that had no name but lived in the chest. The reception was at Red Hollow. Clara had organized it herself, which surprised no one. She had organized it the way she organized everything, without waste, without performance, with the specific attention to detail that made people feel that they'd been thought of. The house was warm and full of people she had chosen, which was a different thing entirely from a house full of people who had simply shown up. Gil had made something he called punch that Clara suspected had more in it than he'd admitted. Russ played harmonica badly, but enthusiastically. Pete sat in the corner and looked genuinely happy, which was still arresting every time she saw it. Ruth came. She stood near the kitchen door, slightly uncertain, and Clara went to her directly and brought her in. "You wrote the note?" Clara said. "You're here." That was all that needed saying. Dr. Pratt came and shook both their hands with the seriousness of a man who is still paying a debt and knows it. Clara took his hand in both of hers and said, "You came. That's the thing that mattered." He had the grace to look like he believed her, and the wisdom to know he wasn't quite finished believing it himself. Edna Marsh had not been invited. Clara had not made a point of excluding her, she had simply made the list, and Edna was not on it. Some omissions were their own kind of statement. At some point in the afternoon, Noah found her in the kitchen, where she had gone to refill something, and he stood in the doorway and said, "How does it feel?" She turned. "What?" "All of it." He gestured vaguely at the house, at the party, at everything. "How does it feel?" Clara considered it. "Like standing on something solid," she said. "Like I finally stopped waiting to fall through the floor." Noah nodded slowly. He understood that. He was 18 years old, and he had spent 3 years waiting to fall through the floor after his mother died. He knew exactly what solid ground felt like when you'd been a long time without it. "Good," he said. "Yes," she said. "Good." The thing that came next was the twist no one had planned for. 3 months after the wedding, a letter arrived at Red Hollow addressed to Clara Walker, the first time she had seen that name written out, and it still startled her slightly, in the way that new true things do. The letter was from a lawyer in Harlan County. She read it standing at the kitchen table, still in her working clothes, still holding the dish she'd been drying when the mail had arrived. She read it twice. Then she sat down. Ethan came in 20 minutes later and found her at the table with the letter in front of her, and an expression he had learned to pay attention to. He sat down. She slid the letter across. He read it. He read it again. He set it down. "Thomas," he said. "Thomas," she confirmed. The letter was from a lawyer representing a woman named Catherine Avery, formerly of Harlan County, recently of Willow Creek, for approximately 4 months. Recently, as of 6 weeks ago, no longer in Willow Creek at all. Thomas Whitmore's engagement to Catherine Avery had ended. According to the lawyer's letter, which had been written on Catherine's behalf and addressed to Clara, as the only woman in the county who might understand, Catherine had discovered certain things about Thomas's history that he had not disclosed. Specifically, a medical history that a doctor in Harlan County, who had been more forthcoming than Dr. Pratt had been, had felt obligated to share when Catherine came to him with questions. Catherine Avery had not been a fool. She had asked the right questions. She had found the right answers. The letter from her lawyer said only this: "Miss Avery wishes Mrs. Walker to know that she understands now what she did not understand before. She is sorry she did not understand sooner. She hopes this finds you well." Clara sat across from Ethan in the kitchen. She thought about Catherine Avery, a woman she had never met, who had come to Willow Creek on the arm of a man with a carefully constructed story, and had ultimately found her way out of it. Who had found somewhere in her the willingness to ask the question that changed everything. She thought about what that cost. She knew exactly what that cost. "She got out," Clara said. "She got out." Ethan agreed. Clara picked up the letter. She folded it carefully. She held it for a moment. "I should write back," she said. "Yes," he said. "I don't know what to say." "Yes, you do," he said. She looked at him. He was right. She did. That evening, she wrote a letter to a woman she had never met in Harlan County, who had lived a version of something Clara understood from the inside. She told her that asking the question took more courage than most people knew. She told her that the shame that would try to attach itself to her in the coming months did not belong to her, and she should return it to the person it came from every single time it arrived. She told her that the truth once spoken cannot be unspoken, and that this was the most useful thing she had learned in the last year of her life. She signed it Clara Walker. Red Hollow Ranch, Willow Creek. She sealed it and gave it to Noah to take to the mail in the morning. Noah took it without asking what it was. He understood that some things were exactly as important as the way they were being handled, and this clearly was. Years passed. Not in the blurred way that time passes when nothing is happening, but in the full weighted way of time that is being used. Red Hollow became what Ethan had always believed it could be. Not just a working ranch, but a reputation. The kind that spreads through a county. The way good things spread quietly and through demonstration rather than announcement. The spring markets were good. Then better. Then very good. The buyers who Thomas had whispered to came to Red Hollow, saw what was actually there, and made contracts that had nothing to do with social politics and everything to do with the quality of the cattle and the reliability of the operation. Gil stayed. He was 61, and had told Ethan once that he'd spent his whole working life looking for somewhere worth putting down roots, and he was not about to leave now that he'd found it. Pete stayed. He eventually talked more, which surprised everyone. It turned out Pete had a great deal to say about farming practices and animal husbandry, and had simply been waiting for a place where he trusted that people would listen. Russ stayed for 4 more years and then married a woman from the next county and moved 2 miles down the road, which meant he was effectively still present every other week. Noah grew into the man his mother had been raising before she ran out of time. He took on more responsibility at the ranch until one day Ethan sat down with him and said, "I want to make you a partner, not an employee, a partner." Noah had looked at him for a long time without speaking, and then said yes in a voice that was doing a great deal of work to stay level. He was 22 years old, and he knew that this was the kind of thing that changes the entire shape of a life. Clara watched all of it happen. She was the person in the center of it who made it possible, not by demanding credit or requiring recognition, but simply by continuing to be the person she was. Organized, present, direct, warm, in the particular way of someone who has been through enough to know that warmth is not weakness, but is in fact one of the hardest things to maintain when the world has given you reasons not to. She and Ethan had a marriage that looked from the outside like a quiet thing. They were not demonstrative in public. They did not speak of their feelings in the kinds of terms that make easy stories. What they had was something that showed itself in the way they moved through a room together, in the way he reached for her hand sometimes when they were sitting at the table, in the way she knew before he said anything, when something was worrying him, and knew exactly how to be beside him without being in the way. It was the kind of love that doesn't need an audience. The kind that isn't about proving anything. The kind that is simply there, solid and reliable. The way good ground is reliable. You don't think about it constantly, you just know it's holding you. The Sunday that mattered most came 6 years after the wedding. Clara hadn't planned to arrive early. She had simply arrived at the usual time and found that the church was fuller than expected, and the only seats available were toward the back. She and Ethan slid into the last pew. Their last pew. Ethan looked at her when they sat down. She looked at the front of the church. She felt something move through her, not pain, not loss, but something more complex than either. Recognition. The sense of being in a place that held everything that had happened in it all at once, layered and present. Around them children filled the space that had once been so deliberately emptied. Their friends' children. Noah's young niece, who had come for a visit, the Henderson boys' little ones. The back pew was full of noise and life and small moving feet. A girl, 7 years old, one of the Hendersons with braids that were already coming undone at this hour of the morning, climbed up on the pew beside Clara and looked at her with the direct curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to be indirect about anything. "Why do you sit here?" she said. "There are empty seats at the front." Clara looked at Ethan. I was looking at her already, with that look, the one that had not changed in 6 years, the one that saw her clearly and did not flinch. She turned to the girl. "Because this is where someone first showed me that I was worth sitting beside," she said. The girl considered this with the gravity of a 7-year-old, processing a sentence that was slightly larger than her current understanding. "Oh," she said. "Then, is that him?" She pointed at Ethan with the complete lack of subtlety available only to children. Clara said, "Yes." The girl looked at Ethan. She looked back at Clara. She nodded with the satisfaction of someone who has sorted something out. "Good," she said, and climbed back down to the floor to find her mother. Ethan reached over and took Clara's hand. She held it. The service began. And Clara Whitmore. Clara Walker now. Clara Walker for 6 years, and for every year after, sat in the last pew of the church in Willow Creek and felt the full weight and rightness of her own life. Not the life the town had tried to write for her. Not the life Thomas had needed her to live so his story could hold together. Not the diminished, apologetic, carefully shrunk life of a woman who had been told repeatedly that she was less than she was. Her life, the one she had built, with her own hands, and with a man who had walked through a door one October Sunday and looked at an empty seat beside a woman everyone avoided and thought simply and without complication, "I'll sit there." That was all it had been at the start. One person choosing to see another person. One person refusing to accept the story the room was telling. One moment of ordinary human decency that had over time become everything. Clara looked at the altar. She breathed. She held Ethan's hand. She did not need anyone's permission to be who she was. She had not needed it for a long time. And that finally, fully without reservation, was enough.